In 2014, dozens of police officers raided a remote farm. They were searching for a missing man who had last been seen in this area. What the police didn't know was that they were about to uncover a crime like no other. They would find themselves facing a killer disposing of his victims in ways unimaginable, even the devil himself might not have thought of. Hello, and welcome to Story Mix. Our story begins on January 1st, 2014. On that day, the children of a man named Robert Heaney gathered in a place called Medford, located in the state of Oregon. These children had not heard from their father for several months, so they went to the area where their father had been living to search for him. What they didn't know was that their father was working for a woman named Susan Monica. Susan owned a farm and lived in a remote location. Robert worked for her, helping with some manual labor in exchange for living on her farm. When the siblings asked Susan about their father, she told them she hadn't seen him for 4 months. She explained that he had abruptly quit his job and disappeared in September of the previous year. The Heaney children asked Susan, "Where is our father's caravan?" because they knew he lived in a caravan on Susan's property. Susan directed them to the caravan's location, and when they arrived, they were surprised to find many of their father's belongings still there. His car and bike were parked beside the caravan, his clothes and leather jackets were inside, and even his work tools were present. Most surprising of all, his dog was still there. The children were baffled. If their father had left, why did he leave everything behind? They concluded, something must have happened to him. Sensing something was amiss, they immediately decided to go to the police department, where they reported the situation. The police began asking questions about Robert's past, his circumstances, and how he ended up in that place. They learned that the missing man, Robert Heaney, had been involved in construction work. In 2003, he divorced his wife after they had 5 children. Robert obtained custody of the children and moved them to Medford, Oregon. As the children grew up and each started their own lives, Robert decided in 2012 to sell the family home and live a more free lifestyle. He bought a caravan, a car, and a bike, and began moving from place to place, living among nature and open spaces that he loved, but he remained in the Medford area. At the beginning of 2013, he saw an ad for a job posted by a woman named Susan Monica. She was looking for someone to help with some manual labor in exchange for a small monthly fee. Robert contacted Susan and told her he didn't want the money. He only wanted to live on her land with his caravan. Susan agreed, and Robert started helping her with the manual labor on her farm. During this period, Robert stayed in touch with his children. Although the communication wasn't strong, they were in contact. After 2 months without being able to reach their father, the children decided to go and search for him. The first thing they did was go to Susan, and then they went to the police. After listening to the story, the police decided that the first step should be to question Susan, as she was the last person to see Robert, but before going to her, they decided to look into her background. They discovered that she was 64 years old, had worked in the Navy before retiring, and had purchased a large isolated piece of land in 1991, which was the same land she now lived on. Initially, Susan wanted to live a quiet life away from the city. She built a small cabin in the middle of her land which lacked electricity or plumbing. Later, she decided to develop the land and build a farm, including a barn and a storage shed. She began working on it herself but found it tiring, so she decided to hire someone to help. Over the past years, she had employed several people to help with manual labor, but none stayed long. The longest someone worked with her was a year before quitting. In 2013, she posted a job advertisement in the nearby town and Robert responded. He worked for her for about 6 months until he disappeared in September 2013. The police knew tracking someone like Robert would be difficult because he had no fixed residence, lived away from people, and conducted transactions in cash rather than using bank cards. They asked Robert's children if they had noticed anything unusual before his disappearance. His eldest son told the police that one of his sisters had been assaulted and raped a few months before their father's disappearance. He said their father had been deeply affected by the news, falling into a state of intense sadness and anger, and had a strong desire for revenge. However, he was unable to do anything as they didn't know who the perpetrator was. Robert fell into a state of depression, began drinking heavily, and then disappeared. Investigators suspected this incident might be related to his disappearance. After gathering all the information, 2 detectives decided to go to Susan's farm to question her. Once they entered the farm, they were struck by the disorder. The place was cluttered with discarded items everywhere, and the buildings were half-finished, along with piles of scrap and trash scattered in every corner. One of the detectives said it felt like they had walked onto the set of a horror film or an apocalypse-themed TV show. As soon as the detectives parked their car, they immediately saw Susan approaching them. When the detectives began talking to her, she was very cooperative, appearing friendly, and genuinely concerned about the situation. She seemed eager to help them find Robert. She told them that Robert had worked for her and assisted her for about 6 months. The arrangement was that he would help with manual labor in exchange for living on her property. Things were going normally for a while, but then a phone call changed everything. Susan said this call apparently came from a family member and delivered some bad news. From that moment, Robert changed completely. He began drinking heavily and became increasingly difficult to deal with. At this point, the detectives realized that the call was likely the one where Robert's son informed him about the assault on his sister. The detectives asked Susan to elaborate on Robert's condition and behavior before he disappeared. Susan said that after the call, Robert became deeply depressed and addicted to alcohol. Even on some nights while in his caravan, she could hear him talking to himself. She reported that she would hear him talking and shouting phrases like, why God?" And it was clear that his mental state was deteriorating day by day. Susan added that once his condition reached this level, she decided to confront him. She wanted to try to persuade him to stop drinking excessively because dealing with him had become increasingly difficult. But before she could speak with him directly, Robert surprised her on September 9, 2013, when he came to her and gave her some money, asking her to take care of his dog for a while because he had important matters to attend to. Susan was puzzled but agreed and took the money, thinking he would be gone for a few days and then return. Susan says she saw Robert get into a white car driven by another man, and from that moment, she never saw him again. After the detectives finished their questions, they thanked Susan for her cooperation and returned to the station. There, they attempted to trace the white car Susan had mentioned, but unfortunately, they had no license plate number, car type, or detailed description, and they couldn't find any results. They then contacted homeless shelters and hospitals to inquire if a man matching Robert's description had come to them, but the answers were always negative. During the investigation, they discovered that Robert had a card called an ABT card, which is used for social services, such as social support and discounts when shopping at stores or supermarkets. The detectives checked the system and found that Robert's card was used in December 2013, 2 months after his disappearance. The card was used at a Walmart branch, a well-known supermarket chain in the US. At this point, the detectives considered a new possibility. Perhaps Robert had disappeared voluntarily since his card was used. He might have decided to distance himself from everyone after the incident involving his daughter. To confirm, they went to Walmart and requested to view the security camera footage. They expected to see Robert using his card. However, they were shocked to see Susan herself using Robert's card. Quickly, the detectives obtained a search warrant for Susan's farm and property. A team of about 5 or 6 officers went to search her farm on January 10, 2014. When the police and detectives entered Susan's property, they confronted her about the card. She immediately showed signs of stress, but quickly composed herself and told them that Robert had given her the card to buy food for his dog, which she was taking care of. The detectives told her, "Okay, anyway, we have a search warrant to search the entire place." Police officers spread out and began searching every corner of the property. One of the officers was filming real-time footage of the search. The place was a dump, with a foul and strong odor pervasive throughout. Piles of scrap and trash were strewn about. There wasn't even any plumbing or running water on the property. Outside, there was a pigsty adding to the stench and filth of the place. The area was disgusting and frightening. Later, the officer filming while walking through the open areas of the farm noticed something discarded on the ground. As he approached, he discovered it was a severed foot, and it wasn't an animal's foot, but a human foot. Immediately, the officer called the detectives and other officers and said, "Look what I found." When they examined the object closely, they confirmed it was a human foot. At this moment, the detectives arrested Susan and took her to the station for questioning. They brought her into the interrogation room, seated her, and began the interrogation. Then, they brought in a lie detector. The detectives confronted Susan with the evidence they had, telling her that they had found a human foot on her property. When Susan realized that the detectives had discovered her secret and her end was near, she changed her story and began to explain what had happened that day. What she revealed was shocking. She said that she found her pigs gathered around something and eating it. When she approached and realized what was happening, she discovered that the thing being consumed was Robert. She tried to drive the pigs away with her hands and saw Robert lying on the ground with his intestines exposed. The problem was, he was still alive. She noticed his hand moving and heard him groaning faintly. Susan said she went inside the house, got a rifle, and shot him to put him out of his misery. She added that she did this out of mercy to relieve him from his suffering, explaining that she usually does this with her pigs when they are sick or in pain, killing them to end their suffering. However, this was the first time she had done this with a human. Afterward, she left Robert in the pigsty, even removing his clothes to make it easier for the pigs to consume him. She left him there for several days, allowing the pigs to eat him at their leisure and dispose of the body. She then gathered the remains and put them in trash bags, but unfortunately, she didn't bother to bury the bags or dispose of them properly. She threw them behind her barn. Apparently, an animal smelled the odor, tore one of the bags, and dragged Robert's leg to the spot where the police found it. The detectives listened to her in shock. This was the first time they had encountered such a case. It might even be the first time a killer had disposed of a victim in such a manner, but according to her, she wasn't the one who killed Robert. She claimed she found him nearly dead, and that all she did was finish him off to relieve him. The detectives asked her, "Well, why didn't you call the police, or why didn't you kill the pigs?" Her response was that she was afraid for her pigs, because if she had reported it, they would have considered her pigs dangerous, and the authorities might have come and killed them. So imagine that her pigs were more important to her than human life. She spoke with a tone of tenderness and sympathy when mentioning her pigs, but when talking about Robert and how her pigs had eaten him while he was still alive, and then how she shot him, her demeanor was cold, colder than ice. At that moment, the detectives realized they were dealing with a mentally disturbed and evil individual. The lead investigator began to suspect that this might not be Susan's first murder. It was impossible for someone to discuss killing a human, even a mercy killing, with such coldness. A person who speaks with such coldness might have a tendency for murder. The lead investigator took a deep breath, looked at Susan, and said, "We're going to search every inch of the farm and all of your properties. So tell us the truth now. Will we find anything else on the farm?" At that moment, Susan showed strong signs of stress, and she began to falter in her speech. When she couldn't put two words together, she asked the detectives for a pen and paper. She took the pen and started drawing a layout of her pigsty, then marked an X on a specific spot. She told the detectives, "You will find something worse at this location." The detectives asked her, "What will we find there?" She replied, "Steve." The detectives were even more puzzled and asked, "Who is Steve?" Susan looked down and began to explain. She said that Robert wasn't the first person to work for her on the farm, nor was he the first person to die there. At this point, the lead investigator said, "I knew this wasn't your first crime." He then added, "We want to hear all the details. Don't try to hide anything because we will uncover it." Susan began to tell them about a man who had worked with her on the farm before Robert. His name was Steve Delicino, and he lived on a farm near Susan's land. Susan had met Steve a year before meeting Robert, and their acquaintance was similar to her meeting with Robert. Susan had posted an ad looking for a worker to help her on the farm. Steve applied for the job, and they started working together in 2012. Susan described Steve as a kind, wonderful, and loving man who helped her with everything she needed. She respected and valued him. But one summer day in 2012, Susan noticed that two of her weapons were missing, and her suspicion fell entirely on Steve, as he was the only one who entered her farm and no one else was around. Susan searched Steve's belongings and indeed found the missing weapons with him. She immediately confronted Steve about it, and an argument ensued, escalating into a physical altercation. Susan had one of her pistols with her, and Steve tried to take it from her, but she resisted. During the struggle over the gun, a shot was fired accidentally. The bullet struck Steve in the side of his head, and the gun fell to the ground. However, the injury wasn't fatal. The bullet struck him from the side of his head and didn't kill him. Afterward, Steve tried to stand, blood streaming from his head. Seeing him standing, Susan decided to run because she was afraid, but Steve continued to chase her, trying to catch her. She kept running until she reached the barn door, where there was a rifle. She grabbed the rifle, aimed it at Steve, and kept shouting at him to stay away, but he kept trying to grab her despite his injury. At that moment, she aimed the rifle at him and fired a fatal shot to his head. Steve died in front of the pigsty. This was Susan's account of the events. She told the detectives that she was saddened by his death because he was close to her and felt a great disturbance about what had happened. She left the place and went to the nearest room to lie down and think. After a while, when she went out to check Steve's body, she was shocked to find that her pigs had gathered around him and started eating him. She said that the pigs dragged his body to their sty. She left his body there with the pigs for 2 weeks until they had completely eaten it. When she returned after that time, she found that only the bones remained. She took the remains, dug a hole behind the barn, and buried them there. Again, the detectives asked her, "If this story is true and it was self-defense, why didn't you report it to the police?" She answered again that she was afraid that the authorities would come and kill her pigs. Imagine, friends, she told the detectives, that the lives of her animals were more important to her than human lives. The detective then asked her, "When we search the place, will we find more victims? Have you done this to someone else? Or are these the only 2 victims?" Susan looked at the detective and said, "I have nothing more to add." The detective feared they were dealing with a serial killer. On January 11, 2014, early in the morning, dozens of police officers and forensic experts descended on Susan's farm to search every inch of it. They immediately found the remains of Robert Henney, Susan's last victim. They then brought in an excavator to retrieve the remains of the second victim, Steve Delicino. They had to dig a large hole to find his bones, and eventually they did and extracted them. The remains of both victims were sent to the lab for analysis. The analysis confirmed the identities of the victims and found evidence on the bones that both men had been eaten by pigs. Even after finding the remains of the victims, the police continued to search the farm, and during the search, they discovered many strange and bizarre items scattered around the place. For example, they found a room filled with personal belongings of other people, furniture, televisions, shoes, and many other items. All these items were piled up next to the pigsty, suggesting they belonged to a large number of people rather than just one. Specifically, they found heaps of shoes. So whose shoes were these? The detectives began to wonder, could there be other victims? They started to suspect that they might indeed be dealing with a serial killer, one of the worst serial killers. The search operations continued for several days. The excavator dug in many places, but in the end, they found no evidence of remains from other potential victims. After her arrest, Susan spent over a year in jail awaiting her trial. Once the prosecution gathered evidence and presented the case, the trial began in April 2015. Susan's defense attorneys argued that she killed Robert out of mercy and Steve in self-defense, admitting her mistake in not reporting the incident to the authorities. However, the surprise came when the prosecution introduced an unexpected witness. The witness was Susan's cellmate from the past year, named Jordan Ferris. Jordan testified that Susan showed no remorse for her crimes and even spoke happily about the events. Sometimes laughing, Jordan mentioned that Susan referred to herself as the sweetest killer in Jackson and hinted at having 17 more victims besides Robert and Steve, saying cryptically, "Haha, if they knew about the other 17, what would they do?" This aligned with the detective's suspicions that Susan might be a serial killer. Imagine, this criminal could have fed her pigs with 19 people, luring them with work like she did with Robert and Steve, and then giving them to her pigs to eat, but in the end, no concrete evidence was found regarding other victims besides Robert and Steve. Nevertheless, she was convicted of their murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. What do you think about this case? Do you believe Susan was a serial killer who murdered many people? Or were Robert and Steve the only victims? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. And so, we've reached the end of our story. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to keep up with more amazing content you can watch here. Thank you for following along, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.